Hello everybody, welcome to week 15 of the course. It's the last week. We made it. All that's left is are the final exams in this week. Okay, so a couple of administrative points in the beginning. The first is that there's a quiz due this week, so I will open that up tomorrow. And there is a discussion question for this week, but it's very, very subjective in a way, right? And essentially it's going to be, what's the most important thing you learned from this class, and how can you apply that knowledge to your everyday life? So I'll post that tomorrow as well. You don't necessarily need to respond to what other students are saying, but if you're reading along and you feel the need to agree with something they've said, or you want to say, it was nice chatting with you, and hopefully I'll see you in another class, that's fine. So that'll be posted. And then the final administrative thing is the final paper. I was looking through the syllabus and I noticed that there are actually two due dates listed. So sorry for the confusion. One is December the 8th, the other is December the 10th. Because I have listed on the syllabus December the 10th, I'm going to say December the 10th is the due date. So email it to me by December 10th, 5 p.m. And a little bit on the format of the paper. I had a few questions about that. Just the basic stuff. It's 6 to 8 pages. I want you to use at least 3 reliable sources. Citations, I do want you to include citations. I also want you to include a reference page. It should be an APA format. And regarding the way the page layout goes, standard stuff. 1-inch margins, double spaced, 12-point font, that kind of thing. And you can find pretty much all this information that I'm telling you, you can find on the paper topics sheet that I posted on Canvas under Files. It gives you sort of a breakdown of what I'm looking for with this paper. And if it's not specified on that particular sheet, you don't need to include it. So you can include a cover page, you don't need to. You can include an abstract, you don't need to. I don't expect you to. You don't have to include body headings in the paper. So just stick essentially with what's actually written down on the guidelines that are listed in that particular topic sheet. Also, something else that I would say is that oftentimes when students are writing papers, and some professors do require this, writing in third person, but I don't require you to write in third person. I think you should write in first person. I think it's clearer. I think it's more easily understood. So for this paper, please go ahead and write in first person. You don't feel like you need to write, this student believes that, this body of research pertains to whatever, right? So you can say, I believe that, this particular argument supports this particular point. So feel free to write in first person. Okay, so I thought what we would do, in this video, it's going to be a little shorter than normal, but it's just going to be some reflections over the general sort of content. It's kind of looking back, right? Looking back over the class. And it's unfortunate that we can't actually have sort of a face-to-face discussion on this, because I think it's a little more dynamic when we can have interaction between us regarding, sort of what the major topics were and what we have learned, right? But going back to the beginning, so I would say one of the central themes of the course is, where does the power in the U.S. government reside, right? Does it reside primarily with the people, as would be the case in a democracy, or does it reside with the elites, which would be an aristocracy, right? Now the ideal solution, and the solution that Madison and the framers of the Constitution were trying to set up, was somewhere in the middle, right? It's a democratic republic. So I thought I could just talk about some of the different institutions and the different devices, and how they break down where the power falls in the hands of the people versus the hands of the elite. So think about the Constitution, right? What are some ways that the Constitution is set up to provide power to the people? I won't answer it right away. I'll give you guys a few seconds to think about it. Okay. So obviously voting, right? Voting is one way, probably the most prominent way that the power is given to the people, right? So we elect our representatives. Now, leaving all electoral college shenanigans aside, which would be perhaps one of the ways that the power is vested in the elite rather than in the people. Voting for our representatives is some form of popular sovereignty, right? Another important thing are the amendments, the constitutional amendments, right? Especially the first 10 or the first 9, the Bill of Rights, right, which enshrine individual liberties given to the people themselves, so that the elite or whatever can't, without being unconstitutional, they can't trample on the rights of the individuals, or they certainly shouldn't. So what are some ways that the Constitution places power in the hands of the elite? Well, the Electoral College, we mentioned, right? It's not necessarily the case that the president is actually voted in by the popular vote. They're voted in through these electors, right? What else? Okay, senators initially in the Constitution were not elected, right? They were appointed. So that's, once again, that's not going to sort of the power of the people. Supreme Court's appointed by the president. So as Madison was talking about in the Federalist Papers, in his case he was talking about, is it a national or federalist government? But here, talking about democracy versus aristocracy, you can see that there are sort of mixed elements, right? There are elements of both in the Constitution, right? So the Constitution, elite, power of the people, kind of straddles the fence a little bit. Of course, some of you pointed out in your discussion the preamble to the Constitution, right? When it starts off with "We the people," it sets a very powerful precedent for popular sovereignty in the United States. Okay, so what about the different political institutions? Do they favor power of the people, or do they favor power of the elite? Let's think about the presidency, for example, right? So, once again, we talked about the Electoral College, but yet, it is the case, at least in most states, that the members of the Electoral College are required to vote along the lines of the majority of the vote in their particular state. Now, one thing that could potentially be, undemocratic in a way, is the winner-take-all notion of the Electoral College, where each state has a certain amount of electoral votes, and even if the person wins by one vote, right, they get all of the electoral votes for that state. So that's why you can run into situations where person can win the majority of the popular vote and still lose the election, as happened in 2000. When Gore won the majority of the popular vote and Bush won the majority of the electoral votes. So, yeah, that's certainly a little controversial, right? We have executive power, right? And that was something that, the framers were very afraid of, right? And in a way, you could almost see it as the opposite of democracy, right? It's almost like a dictatorship, where the president has has the power of executive authority and executive privilege, and has certain rights as the commander-in-chief to wage wars without the input of the legislative branch, which is supposed to be, the legislative branch is supposed to be the branch of the people, right? So there are certainly ways around that. Now, as we know, the legislative branch has certain checks and balances on the executive branch. The president can be impeached. The president can be removed from office if convicted. So yeah, the president, I would say, leans more towards the side of the elite, although there's still this notion of sort of a popular election. There's also the notion that anybody can become president, right? Now, whether that's true or not is another question, whether anybody can, in fact, become president, but at least there's that notion. So what about Congress, right? Congress is supposed to be the branch of the people. They're the representatives of the people who are supposed to carry out, the wishes of the nation, of the nation's people, right? And we ask ourselves the question, is that the case? Do they actually represent the people? Well, certainly in the case you think about the House of Representatives, right, where they're more closely affiliated, with the people that they're supposed to represent. There are certain districts, congressional districts, where the representatives are from, so they're certainly more tied to the people in that way. Senators, perhaps not as much, right? Senators are more removed. And once again, if you look at sort of the growing income divide and the people who are actually serving in Congress, you'll see that they have much more of an elite status. So it's a question of whether, even though they are representing those particular districts, can they actually put themselves in the shoes of the people that they're actually representing. So even though it's supposed to be the branch that where the power of the people is the strongest, it's still becoming questionable, especially regarding what it takes to be elected, right? The amount of money that it takes to win an election. Is it becoming more of an elite institution? But even still, with that, I would say that as far as political institutions of the government go, the legislative branch is still where the power of the people, is most strongly seen. The final branch would be the judicial branch, right? And here again, we have a situation where they're being appointed by the president, right? So it seems like in this case, this would be more of a case of the power, at least of the executive branch, being in the hands of the elite, right? And maybe it should be, right? Because these are the people who are interpreting the law. These are the people that we want to be extremely well educated, as unbiased as possible, right? So I guess you could make the argument that because the president is elected, by the people for the most part, indirectly anyway, and the president appoints Supreme Court justices, maybe on a two-tier scale, there is some influence of the people in who gets appointed to the Supreme Court, right? And it's also extremely arbitrary, right? I mean, Supreme Court justices, as long as they're in good standing, can serve until they die, right? So, whoever, we don't know when we vote for president whether they're going to get Supreme Court appointments, whether they're going to get 5, whether they're going to get 0. Right? A lot of times it depends upon the circumstances. Okay, and then we also talked, besides sort of the Constitution and the political institutions, we also talked about some other major political players in the political process. Right? We talked about interest groups. Remember, these are sort of, you think about what Madison and Hamilton were talking about in the Federalist Papers when they were talking about factions, right? It's a group of interested citizens or corporations that come together to promote a particular interest, right? The NRA are promoting gun rights. Right, so very powerful interest group, and they use lobbyists to try to influence the political process to bring their interests about. Right, and that's where you have sort of this notion of this iron triangle, right, or of the interest networks, the informal networks that form up around these particular regulatory issues. So, the idea is that the interest groups sort of lobby Congress to make laws, or lobby the executive branch or the judicial branch, even in some cases. Those branches try to put things into place through the federal bureaucracy, and the federal bureaucracy will make regulations that are beneficial to the interest groups, and that's how the triangle sort of works. So that's one major player. Another major player are political parties. Right, and political parties are such a major political player that oftentimes we don't even realize that there's nothing in the Constitution that enshrines political parties. It's an informal phenomenon or organizations that have sprung up over time to facilitate the political process because of all the checks and balances and the challenges of government moving efficiently in some cases led to the need for political parties. Right, political parties actually expedite things happening through the federal government in the face of the checks and balances. Now we just take it for granted that we've got the Democratic Party, we've got the Republican Party, and people point to that as like the major source of gridlock in the United States. But it's not clear that gridlock wouldn't even be worse if the political parties were not actually in place, right? The media. The media is another really big political player. We talked about how media politics actually works, right? And we looked at the example of Monica Lewinsky, the scandal that happened with Bill Clinton, right? And that guy was actually making the argument that even though media politics did sort of spike Clinton's approval rates in a negative way, over time it actually came back to the issues. So perhaps, I mean, we certainly know that the media plays a very important role in politics, but perhaps it's overstated sometimes, right? And this guy's argument was that people actually focus on the issues. People are not stupid, so people can actually figure it out. But the problem with the media being that it's largely been corporatized, right? So you have these private organizations that want to use the media to make money for themselves, right? So they're going to sensationalize things, right? And corporations also have political interests, so they're going to try to do things that are in their own political interests, and that's when you get into these things like Fox News and CNN and narrowcasting, where the media organizations target a specific group, whether it's liberals or conservatives or a particular ethnic group or whatever. Other thing that I haven't talked about yet in this class, but it's something worth considering, is this notion of the military-industrial complex, right? If you haven't had a chance to watch President Eisenhower's farewell address, where he addresses sort of the rise of the defense industry, and discusses some of the dangers of that, right? Because defense and war has become a big business, right? So yeah, I mean, you get into these situations where, the defense industry brings jobs to states, right? And it brings money into states. So state senators, state representatives want to support, these installations that are building weapons, that are there, to support the defense industry in whatever way, whatever way they can, right? So that leads to the creation of lots of weapons, right? And there has to be a justification for those weapons usually, right? So, it actually becomes profitable in a lot of ways for us to go to war when one of our major industries is the defense industry. So it's a troubling trend, and Eisenhower was right on the money with it. And, if you look at, the invasion of Iraq, a lot of people will point to the fact that, Dick Cheney made a lot of money. Right? A lot of those guys in the government made a lot of money because they had major stakes in the defense industries. So is the defense industry dictating our foreign policy and the wars that we engage in, right? So certainly something to consider. Okay. So areas of concern, right? There are some troubling trends that I've noticed, right? One is this idea of sort of political disassociation. All right, we've talked about the millennial generation. Around 50% of the millennial generation doesn't identify with either party. They don't consider themselves Democrats or Republicans. Now that's fine in a way, because we don't want to. It gets away from the stereotypes of putting everybody into one bucket, right? When our views are usually much more nuanced than that. But on the other hand, political parties serve a very important role in the political process. So is it the case that if millennials are not joining political parties at the same rate, does that mean, so it could mean a couple of things. One thing, it could mean that there's going to be the creation of a new political party, right? People have talked about the Tea Party, so one possibility. Or does it mean that people just won't participate in elections or won't vote, right? My fear is that it's the latter rather than the former, that it may actually decrease civic engagement to levels below where it currently is, right? Just complete sort of frustration and apathy with the political process, and people just disengage. And when people disengage from the political process, it's game over, right? That's at least in a democracy, anyway. So that's one, sort of troubling trend. Another is this notion of the decline in social trust. Going back to, I hate to keep harping on the millennial generation. I know you guys are a part of it. But I don't think it's completely fair to demonize the generation. But social trust is at an all-time low. 19% of this current generation believes that people in general can be trusted. This is versus 60%, 40 years ago. So, without social trust, it's hard for a democracy to function, right? If you don't believe that the other person, genuinely has your best interests in mind, then how do you compromise? How do you collaborate? How do you do all the things that are necessary for a democratic government or society to flourish, right? So that's certainly a troubling trend. The decrease in civic engagement. I already talked about that. And how civic engagement has changed. Over the years, it's changed from, it used to be people would get engaged, in campaigns, doing things in their community, things like that. Now it's essentially people are just engaging through their checkbook, right? They're sending checks to campaigns and things like that. And immediately once you do that, right, that you have an unlevel playing field, because the people who have more money can be more politically effective, right? Whereas if you're voting with your time, we all, no matter how much money we all have 24 hours in the day, right? But when you're looking at the bank account, once again, you're getting into that level where where the elite are going to dominate, right? And we see that with the super PACs. We see that with the Koch brothers. These huge advocacy groups that have grown up to just dominate the political machine through money, and through the Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court, right? And perhaps the most troubling thing, I think, is this growing income inequality, right? If you look at the disparity between the top 1% of the United States and how much money they have in comparison to the rest of the country, not even to like the bottom 1%, but like the 1%, even from the 10%, huge disparity, right? So you have this ultra rich group, and then at the bottom you're starting to get a group of ultra poor, right? So you have these two competing factions in society, right? And that's the one thing that, going back to Aristotle, knew that if this situation ever gets into the place where you have the rich versus the poor, the government will not survive, right? So we have to figure out some way to make the income distribution a little bit flatter, right? Rather than it sort of doing one of these numbers, right? So those are some of the areas of concern, but there are areas for hope, right? I'm not ready to throw in the towel just yet. First and foremost, I would say that we still have the greatest foundation of any government in the history of history, right? The Constitution. I mean, it's something that has never been done, right? I mean, this idea of individual liberty and government by the people, right? The things that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights, and I believe that we've made progress on those issues. I believe that we're actually more democratic now in a lot of ways than we were when we were first created. Women can vote. We don't have slaves anymore, right? Race relations are certainly not great in the United States, but they're a long shot from where they were when we first started, right? So progress has been made, and I think American history has been the process of taking those words that were written in the Declaration of Independence and written in the Constitution and gradually making them a reality over time, right? A danger of that is enshrining, and this is something that we may be seeing in our society as well, is enshrining individual liberties to such a level that we're forgetting about the common good, right? Now, I think individual liberties are vital, and I think that's the bedrock of our government. But we have to remember that those individual liberties come with corresponding duties to the common good. And if we don't follow through on that, then once again the experiment fails, right? Other causes for optimism: our economy is still strong, right? Our economy is still the largest by a long shot. Our economy, our GDP last year was 17.5 trillion. China's was 10 trillion. It's that gap is actually expected to increase next year. So the economy is doing quite well. So we have the resources, even though we're in debt, right? Our economy is still booming in a lot of ways. And finally, I guess I would say that we've been through difficult times before, right? The Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II. It's not like we haven't had challenges in American history, but we've adapted, and our institutions are put into place to adapt to those changes, right? So I think that there's still hope. I think that we can still adapt. Education levels are going up, right? I believe the more educated we are, with the right values put in place, the more effective our government can be, right? The internet, technology, it could be both a negative and a positive, but if it's harnessed in the right way, technology could actually lead us to a more effective form of governance, right? That would be the ideal hope. So there are lots of reasons for optimism. So don't give up hope just yet. And think about ways that you can participate. Think about things that you can do. If you think the government is doomed and it's important to you, do something about it. That's the main thing, right? And hopefully this class has at least provided you with some of the tools and some of the knowledge necessary to help you take action, right, and figure out what you can do. So essentially that's it. I appreciate you guys participating in the discussions. I thought you guys did a great job. I've learned a lot from those discussions. I hope you have as well. I want to say I'm here to help you guys, not just for this class, but down the road. If you have questions, if you need letters of recommendation, send me an email, or you just want to chat sometime, happy to do that as well. Send me an email. And good luck. Good luck with the rest of your semester. And I enjoyed having class with you. So look forward to reading your final papers. And if you have any questions, let me know.